The city pulsed with light that night. Neon signs flickering against glass towers, like electric veins running through concrete flesh, and the rhythmic hum of engines filling the streets with a mechanical heartbeat that never seemed to rest. At the top of the hill, overlooking the glittering sprawl of wealth and ambition below, stood La Belle Maison, a restaurant that glittered like a perfectly cut diamond under the moonlight. Known only to the wealthy elite who could afford its astronomical prices, feared by its staff who walked on eggshells every shift, and admired from a distance by anyone who could only afford to walk past its golden doors and dream of what lay beyond. Inside those hallowed halls, beneath crystal chandeliers that caught and refracted light into 1,000 dancing rainbows, and through a haze of expensive perfume that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible curtain, separating the privileged from the rest of the world, laughter echoed off marble walls and vaulted ceilings. Silver spoons clinked against fine china with a delicate music that spoke of refinement and excess, and the hum of conversation was smoother than the jazz playing softly in the background, flowing through the dining room like expensive wine. Every movement inside was calculated down to the smallest gesture. Every smile rehearsed 1,000 times in front of mirrors. Every word chosen carefully to maintain the illusion of effortless superiority that wealth demanded. The tables were adorned with white linen so pristine it seemed to glow under the soft lighting. Centerpieces of exotic flowers flown in from distant countries at ridiculous expense, and silverware so polished you could see your reflection in its surface. The walls were decorated with original paintings by artists whose names alone commanded respect in the art world, and the floor was Italian marble that had been quarried specifically for this establishment. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was a temple to wealth. A cathedral of consumption where the wealthy came not just to eat, but to be seen, to network, to remind themselves and others of their place in the social hierarchy. Among the servers gliding between tables with practiced grace was Maya Lopez, a young waitress with steady hands that never trembled no matter how heavy the tray, and tired eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone so young. Her hair was neatly tied back in a regulation bun, not a single strand out of place. Her uniform spotless despite having worked for hours already. Her posture perfect as she moved through the dining room with the kind of invisible efficiency that the wealthy preferred in their servants, present when needed, invisible when not. Though her shoes, hidden under the long black skirt of her uniform, were cracked at the sides and worn thin at the soles, held together more by hope and determination than by any structural integrity they once possessed. She'd been on her feet since 10 o'clock that morning, rushing between the breakfast service, the lunch rush, and now the dinner shift that would stretch past midnight. But her focus never wavered, her smile never faltered, her professional demeanor never cracked. She wasn't there for dreams of glory or aspiration of climbing some corporate ladder or fantasies of being discovered by some wealthy patron who would lift her out of poverty like in the fairy tales she'd stopped believing in years ago. She was there for survival, pure and simple. She was there because her younger brother needed medication that insurance wouldn't cover. Because their tiny apartment in the rough part of town demanded rent every month without fail. Because the electricity company and the water company and the phone company didn't care about sob stories or hard luck, they cared about payment. Every smile she forced, every yes, sir, and right away, ma'am, she uttered, every humiliation she swallowed without complaint, it was all for Leo, for keeping him alive, for giving him the chance at a future their parents would have. Wanted. At table 14 sat a group that immediately drew everyone's attention. The moment they entered, not because they were particularly loud or ostentatious in their behavior, but because of the invisible aura round them. The way other diners' conversations would pause slightly when they walked by. The way the manager himself had personally escorted them to the best table in the house. They carried themselves like kings surveying their kingdom, like gods who had descended from Mount Olympus to grace the mortals with their presence. At the center of this group sat Ethan Vale, billionaire CEO of Vale Industries, a multinational conglomerate with fingers in everything from technology to real estate to pharmaceutical researcher, a man whose smile could make headlines in business journals across the globe, and whose temper could ruin lives with a single phone call or a word to the right person in the right place. His tailored navy suit seemed to absorb the dim, golden light of the restaurant, custom-made by a designer whose waiting list was measured in years. The fabric probably costing more than Maya made in 6 months. The watch on his wrist was platinum and diamonds, casual opulence worn without thought. His dark hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place, and his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. Around him, partners and executives and various hangers-on laughed at every word that left his lips, every half-smirk he gave in response to someone's attempt at humor, every casual observation about the stock market or the latest merger, or the incompetence of competitors. To them, he wasn't just a man, he was power personified. Success made flesh, the American dream walking and talking and making them all feel small by comparison, even as they basked in the reflected glory of his presence. When Maya approached their table with her notepad ready and her professional smile fixed firmly in place, she could feel the tension radiating from the group like heat from a furnace, the kind of tension that comes from serving people who believe they own not just the restaurant, not just the city, but the world itself and everything in it. The kind of people who viewed service workers as slightly more sophisticated versions of the furniture, functional objects to be used and then forgotten the moment they left your field of vision. She cleared her throat softly and smiled politely, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "Good evening, sir. May I take your order?" Ethan didn't even look up from his phone, his thumb scrolling through what appeared to be emails or stock reports, or messages from people trying desperately to get his attention. He was scrolling with the kind of casual indifference that suggested nothing on that screen was actually important. But looking at it was still more interesting than acknowledging the waitress standing beside his table. "We already ordered," he said flatly, his tone suggesting that this was somehow her fault for not knowing this information telepathically. "Just be quick when you bring it." "Yes, sir," she said softly, her smile not wavering even slightly as she placed down a fresh napkin that one of the executives had crumpled and dropped on the floor. and refilled their water glasses with practiced efficiency. The pitcher never spilling a single drop despite the trembling she felt deep inside her chest. Asterisk as she reached across the table to refill a glass on the far side. One of the executives, a red-faced man named Carson, whose cheeks spoke of too much rich food and expensive alcohol, laughed loudly, the sound cutting through the refined atmosphere like a chainsaw through silk. "Careful, sweetheart," he said with a smirk that made her skin crawl, his words slightly slurred at the edges. "That's worth more than your month's rent." He pointed at his champagne glass with a thick finger. A glass that probably did indeed cost more than she paid for her cramped apartment, with its leaking faucet and the heater that only worked half the time. A few of them laughed at this observation, finding humor in the economic disparity between their world and hers, amused by the reminder of their own wealth and her poverty. Maya's cheeks warmed with shame and anger that she couldn't express, but she didn't respond. Didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten under her skin. She simply nodded with that same professional smile and moved on to the next table, her hands steady even though her heart was pounding with humiliation when she returned 15 minutes later with their meal, perfectly prepared dishes that had been plated with artistic precision by chefs who took their work seriously even if the diners barely noticed. Ethan finally looked up from his phone for the first time since she'd approached. His eyes swept over her with the kind of assessment one might give a piece of furniture being considered for purchase, cold and calculating and utterly devoid of human warmth. "Is this the best they have working here?" he muttered to his associate sitting beside him, not even trying to lower his voice, not caring that she was standing right there and could hear every word. "I've seen hotel staff in Monaco move faster." Maya froze for just a second, her tray trembling slightly in her hands, as the words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to cut, to diminish, to remind her of her place in the grand scheme of things. But she recovered quickly, years of practice in swallowing her pride allowing her to maintain her composure, even as something inside her crumbled a little more. "I apologize for the delay, sir," she said calmly, her voice not betraying the storm of emotions churning inside her chest. "We're short on staff tonight." It was true 2 servers had called in sick and management had refused to find replacements, preferring to overwork the remaining staff rather than pay for adequate coverage. Ethan smirked, a cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and distant and utterly without empathy. Short on staff or short on standards? The words hung in the air like poison gas, designed to wound, to humiliate, to establish dominance. The table chuckled again, a chorus of sycophants eager to please their king by laughing at his jokes, no matter how cruel they might be. The words were sharp enough to slice her pride open, to expose the raw nerve of her dignity and pour salt directly onto it. Still, Maya stayed silent, her jaw clenched so tight it ached, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. Her father's voice echoed in her mind from years ago, back when he was still alive and would comfort her after particularly hard days. At school, grace under fire. Maya, never let their words burn your soul. The only power they have over you is the power you give them. He'd been a good man. Her father, a construction worker who died on a job site when safety equipment failed, leaving her and Leo alone in a world that didn't care about their grief or their struggle. But then came the final blow, the ultimate insult that would cement this night in her memory forever. When the bill arrived on its leather folder, presented with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy texts, Ethan tossed a black credit card onto the tray without looking, without even breaking his conversation with the man beside him about some acquisition in Singapore. The total was enormous, $2,800 for wine that came from vineyards he probably owned, steak that had been aged for months and flown in from Japan, and laughter at jokes that weren't funny. Maya ran the card through the machine with trembling fingers, returned the receipt, and waited with a professional smile for the tip section to be filled out, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, their earlier cruelty had been a momentary lapse, and they would show some small measure of decency now. Ethan picked up the pen, scribbled something quickly with barely a glance at the paper, stood up from his chair with the casual grace of someone who'd never had to worry about money, or consequences, or the feelings of people he considered beneath him, and buttoned his jacket with deliberate slowness. He looked directly at Maya for the first time that evening, really looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with something that might have been amusement, or might have been contempt, or might have been both. "Keep the smile," he said with a thin grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "It's the only tip you'll get tonight." The table erupted in laughter, genuinely amused by what they clearly considered a witty observation, their voices carrying across the restaurant and drawing curious glances from other diners, who wondered what could possibly be so funny. Ethan's entourage followed him out, still chuckling and replaying the moment, the sound of their mirth echoing through the restaurant like cruel music. Like the soundtrack to her humiliation, the sound seemed to chase Maya even as they disappeared through the golden doors and into the night, where their luxury cars waited to whisk them away to penthouses and mansions. Maya stood frozen for a long moment, the receipt clutched in her hand, looking at the empty tip line, where nothing had been written except a single harsh line through the space. Her reflection in the wine glass on the table stared back at her tired eyes in a young face, dark circles that makeup couldn't quite hide, lips pressed together in what was supposed to be a smile, but looked more like a grimace, tired, small, invisible. All the wealth and luxury surrounding her, crystal and gold and marble and silk, and she felt like a ghost haunting a world she would never belong to, working in a palace she could never afford to dine in, serving people who would never see her as human. She forced a smile, a real effort of will that felt like lifting a tremendous weight. As the manager passed by with his clipboard and his perpetually concerned expression, "Everything fine here, Miss Lopez?" he asked without really looking at her, already moving on to the next crisis, the next complaint from some wealthy patron who felt their experience wasn't quite perfect enough. "Yes, sir," she lied, the words automatic now, programmed into her by years of service work and the unspoken rule that the customer is always right, even when they're cruel and wrong and terrible. Everything's fine. But inside, something cracked. a tiny fracture in the armor she'd built around her heart, a small piece of her dignity that had been chipped away and could never quite be restored. She'd faced rudeness before, had dealt with difficult customers and bad tippers and people who treated her like she was invisible. But something about tonight felt different, felt worse, felt like it had cut deeper than usual. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working 14 hours straight. Maybe it was the worry about Leo's medication running out. Maybe it was just the accumulation of 1,000 small indignities finally becoming too much to bear. She cleared the table mechanically, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind was elsewhere, stacking the plates and glasses and silverware with the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice. She wiped down the table where they'd sat, removing every trace of their presence, and reset it for the next group of wealthy diners who would come and look through her, just like these people had. The entire process took maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours, each second stretching out as she replayed the evening in her mind, heard their laughter echo in her memory, saw that thin, cruel smile on Ethan Vale's face as he delivered his final insult. Outside the restaurant, hours later, when her shift finally ended and she was released into the night, the wind was cold, cutting through her thin jacket like it wasn't even there. Maya walked home through dim alleys and side streets, clutching her jacket around her shoulders in a futile attempt to keep warm, her feet aching in those cracked shoes, her entire body screaming for rest that she knew wouldn't come easily tonight. The city lights blurred through her tears, neon signs becoming watercolor paintings through the moisture in her eyes, and she didn't even try to hold them back anymore. Didn't see the point in maintaining that professional composure when there was no one around to see her fall apart. She passed billboards featuring Ethan Vale's face-massive advertisements for Vale Industries that seemed to be on every corner, his confident smile looking down at the city like a benevolent god, accompanied by words like innovation, vision, power, marketing slogans that painted him as some kind of visionary leader, a captain of industry guiding civilization into the future. All she could think, looking at those perfectly airbrushed images, was how easily power mocks humility, how the people with everything felt entitled to take away the dignity of people with nothing. How the system was rigged to favor people like him while crushing people like her. She thought about Leo waiting at home, probably already asleep on their second-hand couch, with his homework scattered on the coffee table, trusting her to keep them afloat, to keep food in the fridge and medicine in the cabinet, and hope alive that things might someday get better. She thought about her parents, gone now for years but still present in her memory, and wondered what they would say about the life she was living, about the humiliations she endured just to survive. Would they be proud that she'd kept going, kept fighting, kept Leo safe? Or would they be heartbroken that their daughter had to swallow so much cruelty just to make ends meet? The walk home took 45 minutes. She couldn't afford the bus fare most nights, needed to save every penny, and by the time she reached their apartment building, with its cracked concrete steps and flickering hallway lights, she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. This was soul-deep exhaustion, the kind that sleep couldn't fix, the kind that came from years of struggling against a system designed to keep people like her in their place. But she didn't know. As she climbed those stairs with leaden feet and let herself into the small apartment where Leo slept peacefully, that the man who humiliated her would soon be the same man begging for her forgiveness. That fate had its own plans in motion. That karma was preparing to flip the script in ways neither of them could imagine. She didn't know that the key to a mansion would become the key to redemption. That the greatest act of kindness she would ever perform was waiting just around the corner, hidden in the rain and darkness of a night that would change everything. She simply collapsed onto her bed fully clothed, too tired even to change, and let sleep take her away from the memory of cruel laughter and empty tip lines, away from the weight of poverty and the burden of responsibility, into dreams where maybe, just maybe, the world was a little bit kinder. Rain fell like shattered glass over the city 3 nights later, each drop exploding against pavement and glass, and metal with enough force to create a constant roar that drowned out almost everything else. The streets that once shimmered with neon lights and the glow of wealth now blurred under sheets of silver water that turned the entire city into an impressionist painting, all soft edges and running colors. Thunder rolled across the sky like God rearranging furniture, and lightning occasionally split the darkness with branches of electric white that illuminated the world for split seconds before plunging it back into darkness. Inside his sleek black Mercedes, even Vale drove too fast for conditions like these. Too fast for someone whose attention was divided between the road and the storm of thoughts raging inside his head. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, beating back and forth in a frantic rhythm that matched his heartbeat. But his thoughts were louder than the thunder rumbling overhead, more turbulent than the storm tearing across the city. He was still angry, though he didn't even know at whom anymore, or what exactly had triggered this black mood that had been following him for days like a shadow he couldn't shake. At his investors for questioning his decisions during the last board meeting. At his ex-wife Sarah for leaving him 2 years ago, with that final cutting remark about him being emotionally unavailable and fundamentally incapable of seeing other people as fully human, at his employees for their perceived laziness and incompetence, their inability to read his mind and anticipate his needs before he even knew what they were. At the waitress from the other night, maybe, that Maya Lopez woman with her quiet dignity and her tired eyes, for daring to remind him of something human in himself that he'd thought he'd successfully buried years ago under layers of ambition and ruthlessness, and the armor that success demanded. He couldn't stand people who looked at him with that kind of quiet pity, that suggestion that perhaps beneath all his wealth and power, he was just another flawed human being, struggling with the same existential questions and emotional needs as everyone else. That face, her face, with its careful composure, even as he insulted her, had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, to himself or anyone else. There was something in her eyes that had haunted him for 3 days now, some quality of endurance and grace that made him feel small. In a way his billions couldn't compensate for. As the rain pounded harder against the car, turning visibility into a gray blur where streetlights became smears of yellow, and red taillights ahead became diffuse glows in the murk. His phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time that evening. He glanced down briefly, dangerous as it was in these conditions, and saw a text from his secretary, Margaret. Ever diligent even at this late hour. Reminder, board meeting at 8 a.m. Don't be late. Sir, Chen is planning to challenge the Singapore expansion. He cursed under his breath, his hands tightening on the leather-wrapped steering wheel until his knuckles went white. They should be reminding themselves to impress me, he muttered to the empty car, his voice barely audible over the rain hammering on the roof. They work for me, not the other way around. He was still the untouchable billionaire in his mind, still the master of his universe, still the man who shaped reality to his will rather than being shaped by it. Until the world decided otherwise. Until fate decided to remind him that nobody was truly untouchable. That physics and chance didn't care about bank accounts or business empires. He took a sharp turn toward the highway, tires hissing against wet asphalt with a sound like tearing fabric. The car hydroplaning slightly before the expensive German engineering compensated and brought it back under control. He pressed the accelerator harder, pushing 70 in a 55 zone, the engine responding with a purr of barely constrained power. The rain was a solid wall now, the wipers almost useless. But he was Ethan Vale, and the universe bent to his will, and he would make it home. Because he always did. Because failure wasn't part of his vocabulary. Because, and that's when it happened, a sudden flash of headlights from the wrong direction, impossibly bright through the rain, growing larger with terrifying speed. A truck had skidded out of control in the opposite lane, its driver invisible behind the glare, its horn blaring a warning that came too late. The sound distorted by the Doppler effect and the rain and the screaming in Ethan's mind. As his brain processed what was about to happen faster than his body could react, Ethan slammed the brakes with both feet, the car's anti-lock system chattering as it tried to maintain control. But it was too late, physics taking over where willpower ended. The world flipped in slow motion and yet impossibly fast at the same time. A contradiction his mind couldn't process. Metal screamed, a sound he'd never heard before and would never forget. The shriek of engineered steel being forced into shapes it was never meant to hold. Glass shattered into a million diamonds that hung suspended in the air for a moment, before raining down on him like crystalline confetti. The airbag exploded into his face with enough force to break his nose, and he felt to rather than heard the sounds of his car disintegrating around him as it tumbled and scraped and finally, mercifully, came to rest. Then dash silence. Not true silence. Because the rain still fell, and the engine ticked as it cooled, and somewhere in the distance, sirens were already beginning to wail. But relative silence after the cacophony of destruction. The kind of silence that exists in the immediate aftermath of violence. When the body is still processing trauma, and the mind hasn't caught up to the new reality it's been thrust into. When Ethan's consciousness swam back from wherever it had gone during those seconds of impact, he found himself in darkness punctuated by flashing warning lights and the intrusion of rain. The car was half crushed against a guardrail. The entire passenger side crumpled like aluminum foil. The roof bent at an angle that shouldn't be possible. Rain poured in through the broken window, cold against his skin, mixing with something warm running down his face that he distantly recognized as blood. His arm was bleeding, a deep gash that painted red streaks across his torn shirt sleeve. His left leg was pinned beneath the steering wheel, which had been driven back into the cabin during the impact, and when he tried to move it, white-hot pain shot through his entire body like electricity. He tried to move, to free himself, but his body wouldn't respond properly, everything feeling disconnected and sluggish. The phone on the passenger seat buzzed again. The screen cracked into a spider web pattern, but somehow still glowing faintly with another message he would never read. Ethan reached out with his good arm, fingers stretching desperately toward that cracked screen, toward connection with the outside world, toward help, but the pain shot through his side, white-hot and overwhelming, and he couldn't reach it, couldn't bridge those final 6 inches between his fingertips and salvation. He shouted into the storm, "Help! Somebody help me!" But the words were swallowed by the rain before they'd traveled more than a few feet from his lips, absorbed by the storm as if the universe was indifferent to his suffering, as if his money and power meant nothing when measured against wind and water, and the cruel randomness of fate. The clock on the dashboard blinked to 4:03 a.m., the numbers flickering on and off as electrical systems failed, and briefly recovered in the wreckage of the car. He was going to die here, Ethan realized with a strange clarity that cut through the pain and confusion. He was going to bleed out in the ruins of his luxury car, and all his billions wouldn't make any difference because you couldn't buy your way out of physics or negotiate with death. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange calm settling over him, a sense of inevitability and perhaps even justice. At that same hour, across town in a neighborhood that people like Ethan Vale never visited unless they got very lost, Maya Lopez was walking home from her second shift of the day, this time from a convenience store where she worked 3 nights a week stocking shelves and manning the register for customers who came in at odd hours. She was soaked through despite her jacket, exhausted beyond the point where coffee would help, but still thinking about Leo, who would wake up early for school and would need breakfast and encouragement and the kind of normalcy she tried desperately to maintain despite their circumstances. She passed the edge of the highway on her usual route home, head down against the rain, thinking about nothing except putting one foot in front of the other until she reached their apartment and could finally rest. But then she noticed something through the sheets of rain-flickering hazard lights, where they shouldn't be. The red and yellow blinking creating an irregular strobe effect against the guardrail. Her heart jumped in her chest, instinct overriding exhaustion, and she knew immediately that something was very wrong. Without hesitation, without stopping to consider her own safety, or whether this was wise, or what it might cost her, she ran forward, clutching her bag to her chest to keep it from flying open, her worn shoes splashing through puddles that had become small rivers. When she reached the scene, she saw the wreckage of a luxury Mercedes crumpled against the guardrail like a child's toy that had been stepped on, its black paint glistening with rain and reflecting the emergency lights in distorted patterns. The emblem on the front was bent almost beyond recognition, the engine still steaming even in the rain, wisps of white vapor rising into the night air. "Mister, can you hear me?" she shouted over the storm, pressing her face close to the shattered window, trying to see inside the dark interior of the wreck. A faint groan answered her, barely audible over the rain. "Help me." The voice was weak, thready with pain and shock, but it was their proof of life. Proof that whoever was inside could still be saved if she acted quickly enough. Maya grabbed the door handle and pulled with all her strength, her hands slipping on the wet metal. But it was jammed, the frame bent in a way that wouldn't allow it to open. She looked around frantically for something, anything that could help, and spotted a fallen branch from a tree that had been struck by lightning at some earlier point in the storm. She grabbed it with trembling, hands trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline and determination, and the desperate need to save whoever was trapped. Inside that metal coffin, she wedged the branch into the gap between the door and the frame and used it as a lever, throwing all her weight against it, using physics and desperation in equal measure. The first attempt failed, the wood flexing but the door remaining stubbornly closed. The second attempt produced a grinding sound but nothing more. On the third attempt, with a prayer to parents who couldn't hear her and a strength she didn't know she possessed, the door finally gave way with a loud creak of protesting metal, swinging open far enough for her to reach inside. Ethan's face came into view in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, and the flashing hazard signals pale as death itself. Blood streaked across his features in dark rivulets that the rain was slowly washing away. Half conscious, his eyes unfocused and struggling to stay open. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she froze completely, her breath catching in her throat. That face, she knew it. The arrogant man from the restaurant 3 nights ago. The billionaire who had humiliated her in front of his friends, who had refused to leave even $1 on a $3,000 bill, who had told her to keep the smile as if it was the funniest thing in the world. Her heart thudded against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. The same man who had made her cry on her walk home, who had made her question her dignity and her worth, who represented everything wrong with a system that elevated cruelty and rewarded those who treated others as less than human. That man now looked helpless, broken, fragile in a way that was almost obscene in its reversal of their previous dynamic. She could have walked away. No one would know. No one would blame her. He deserved this, didn't he? Karma had caught up with him faster than expected, and she could just leave. Let fate run its course. Let him experience what it felt like to be helpless and alone, and at the mercy of an uncaring universe. The thought flickered through her mind for maybe 2 seconds, tempting in its simplicity, seductive in its justice. But instead, she heard her father's voice from years ago, teaching her about character when no one was watching. The measure of who you are isn't how you treat people who can help you, Maya. It's how you treat people who can't, she whispered. Hang on, and reached into the wreckage. She pulled him out with all her strength, her arms screaming in protest as she supported his weight, dragging him inch by inch through the rain-slicked ground until they both collapsed by the roadside, several yards from the wreckage, far enough away that if the car caught fire they might be safe. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight that her exhausted muscles could barely manage. But adrenaline and sheer willpower carried her through. He coughed, blood on his lip mixing with rain and running down his chin in pink streams. His eyes struggled to focus on her face, recognition slowly dawning despite the pain and shock. "Why are you?" "Save your breath," she interrupted, her voice firm despite her own trembling. She tore her scarf from around her neck, the nice one that Leo had saved up to buy her for Christmas last year, and wrapped it around his bleeding arm, tying it tight enough to slow the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely. Her hands worked on autopilot, some instinct taking over even though she had no medical training beyond basic first aid. Her phone barely had signal out here on the edge of the highway, the connection flickering in and out, but she managed to call 911 after 3 attempts. As she spoke to the operator, giving their location and describing the injuries as best she could with no medical vocabulary to draw on, Ethan kept staring at her with eyes that were wide and confused and seeing something impossible. "You," he breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're that waitress from the restaurant." She didn't reply to that, keeping her attention focused on the emergency operator who was asking questions and giving instructions and promising that help was on the way. But inside, her mind was racing. Yes, she was that waitress. The one you humiliated. The one whose dignity you crushed for the entertainment of your friends. The one you thought was so far beneath you that you couldn't even be bothered to leave a tip or treat with basic human decency. All she said, after hanging up the phone and turning back to him with rain streaming down her face, was, "You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Just stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me your name." She knew his name, of course. Everyone in the city knew who Ethan Vale was, but she needed to keep him conscious, needed to keep him focused on something other than the pain. "Ethan," he managed, teeth chattering from shock and cold. "Ethan Vale, *I Maya," she said, even though he wouldn't remember, even though people like him never remembered the names of people like her. "Stay with me, Ethan. Keep your eyes open." The ambulance sirens sliced through the storm 15 minutes later, though it felt like hours had passed in that liminal space between the accident and rescue. As the paramedics lifted Ethan onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency, checking his vitals and starting and for line and radioing ahead to the hospital, he gripped Maya's wrist weakly with his good hand, his fingers cold and trembling. "Why?" he rasped, the single word carrying the weight of all his confusion. "After what I said. After how I treated you?" Maya looked down at him, rain dripping from her hair onto his face, her expression unreadable in the flashing lights of the ambulance. For a moment, she considered telling him exactly what she thought of him, giving voice to the anger and hurt she'd been carrying for 3 days. But instead, she simply said, "Because you're human, and you needed help." The words were simple but contained within them a philosophy that Ethan Vale had forgotten somewhere along his climb to the top, that humanity wasn't something you earned with money or status, that compassion wasn't transactional, that the measure of a person came down to their actions when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose. He wanted to reply, wanted to ask her to stay, wanted to say something that would bridge the impossible gap between them and make sense of this moment. But darkness swallowed him before he could form the words. Consciousness slipping away as the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance and started working to stabilize him for transport. Maya stood in the rain watching the ambulance disappear into the night, its lights fading into red and white streaks that eventually vanished around a corner. She stood there for a long moment, soaked to the bone, exhausted beyond measure, her nice scarf gone and her hands shaking from adrenaline crash. Then she picked up her bag, turned toward home, and started walking again. Just another invisible person in a city that never stopped moving. She didn't know if Ethan Vale would live or die. She didn't know if he would remember her or this night. She didn't know that she had just set in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. She just knew that she'd done the right thing, and that would have to be enough. The morning sun poured softly through the hospital blinds 3 days later, creating parallel bars of gold and shadow across the sterile white walls of room 407. Ethan Vale sat upright for the first time since the accident, his torso wrapped in bandages that pulled tight with every breath, his left leg encased in white plaster from ankle to mid-thigh, his face bearing the fading yellow-purple marks of impact and trauma. He had spent the past 72 hours drifting in and out of consciousness, floating through morphine dreams where metal screamed and rain fell endlessly, and a woman's face appeared again and again, her eyes sad but resolute, her hands gentle as they wrapped his wounds in a scarf that smelled faintly of lavender. Now, fully conscious for the first time since the accident, he found himself replaying that night on an endless loop, not the crash itself, which remained fragmented and dreamlike in his memory, but what came after. The rain dripping from her hair onto his face, cold drops mixing with warm blood, her trembling hands as she tied the tourniquet, the pressure just right, suggesting she'd done this before or had some instinct for healing. The calm in her voice when everything else was chaos and pain and the very real possibility of death. She had saved his life. This woman whose name he'd never bothered to remember until she told it to him. While he lay bleeding on the ground, Maya, she'd said, "I'm Maya," and the sound of it had cut through the fog of shock with startling clarity. A waitress had saved his life. A woman he'd humiliated in front of his colleagues and friends, whose dignity he'd trampled for the cheap entertainment of people, whose respect meant nothing to him in retrospect. And that thought, that impossible contradiction between the cruelty he'd shown her and the compassion she'd shown him, refused to leave him alone. It haunted him through the morphine haze, through the visits from his assistant and his lawyers and the board members, who were already discussing how to spin this accident in the press. It whispered to him in the quiet moments between nurse visits and vital checks. Why did she save you? What kind of person does that? The physical pain was manageable with medication, but this other kind of pain, this psychological dissonance, this moral whiplash had no pharmaceutical solution. He kept seeing her face in his mind, kept hearing her quiet voice saying, "Because you're human," as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. As if the basic fact of shared humanity trumped everything else: money, status, past insults. all of it irrelevant in the face of someone who needed help. His assistant Margaret had visited yesterday, bringing him his laptop and phone and a stack of documents that needed his attention. All the machinery of his business empire that couldn't stop just because its CEO was in a hospital bed. She'd filled him in on the company news, the stock price fluctuations, the competitor movements, the thousand details that usually consumed his every waking moment. But for the first time in his adult life, Ethan found he didn't care. None of it seemed important compared to the question burning in his mind. Who is Maya Lopez, really? Not the waitress in the uniform, not the anonymous service worker he'd insulted, but the actual human being who had risked herself to save a stranger. No, not a stranger. Someone who had actively wronged her without expecting anything in return. On the morning of the fourth day, when his mind was clear enough and his body strong enough to make demands, he told Margaret, "I need you to find someone for me." Margaret looked up from her tablet, where she was taking notes about some merger negotiation. A private investigator, a lawyer. The truck driver's information is all ready. No, Ethan interrupted, his voice still raspy from the breathing tube they'd removed 2 days ago. A woman. Her name is Maya Lopez. She's a waitress at La Belle Maison. He paused, remembering. She's the one who pulled me out of the car. The one who called the ambulance. She saved my life. Margaret. Margaret's expression shifted from professional efficiency to something softer, something almost surprised, as if she hadn't expected her boss to care about details like who had saved him, or to remember the name of someone outside his usual social stratosphere. Of course, Mr. Vale. I'll have a full report by this afternoon. Discreetly, he added. I don't want to frighten her or make her think. Just find out about her life, where she lives, her situation, her family. I need to understand. Margaret nodded, making notes. And Ethan could see the questions in her eyes even though she was too professional to ask them. Why did he care so much? What was he planning? This wasn't like him. Wasn't like the Ethan Vale she'd worked for over the past decade. The man who barely remembered the names of his own employees, unless they directly affected his bottom line. But she simply said, I'll take care of it, and left him alone with his thoughts and the steady beep of the heart monitor. That proved he was still alive, still human, still capable of being saved by someone who had every reason to walk away. By late afternoon, Margaret returned with a thin manila folder that somehow felt heavier than it should. When she placed it on his hospital bed tray, everything we could find on short notice, she said. It's not much. She doesn't have much of a digital footprint. No social media to speak of. No public records beyond the basics. Ethan opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from weakness or anticipation he couldn't say. Inside was a collection of documents and printouts that told the story of a life, lived on the margins, a life he'd never had to think about or consider, or acknowledge existed outside of abstract statistics about income inequality. The first page was a basic information sheet. Maya Lopez, age 26, current residence, 847 East Briar Street, apartment 3B. The address meant nothing to him. He'd never been to that part of town. Would have no reason to go there. probably drove past exits leading to that neighborhood without even noticing. Employment: La Belle Maison host, waitress, Quick Mart convenience store cashier, night shift, 2 jobs, he noted. 2 different service industry positions that together probably barely covered rent and expenses. How many hours a week did she work? 60? 70? When did she sleep? He flipped to the next page and found a photograph. Not a professional headshot, but what looked like a DMV photo Maya with her hair tied back. No makeup, no smile for the camera. Just a tired young woman meeting the lens with eyes that had seen too much. Even in this unflattering bureaucratic photograph, there was something in her face that struck him a quiet strength. A determination that hadn't been broken by circumstances that would have crushed most people. This was the face of someone who got up every morning and faced another impossible day. And did it anyway because there was no other choice. Because someone depended on her. Because giving up wasn't an option. The next section detailed her family situation. One dependent, Leo Daniel Lopez, age 15, younger brother. Parents deceased father died in construction accident 2015. Mother died of cancer 2017. Maya Lopez became legal guardian of minor sibling at age 18. Ethan read those lines 3 times, each reading hitting harder than the last. She'd been 18 when her mother died, barely an adult herself, and she'd taken on the responsibility of raising her teenage brother. That meant she'd spent the last 8 years her entire young adulthood. The years when most people were discovering themselves and making mistakes and figuring out who they wanted to be, working multiple jobs and sacrificing her own dreams to keep Leo safe and fed and housed. But the next section was what made Ethan close his eyes and lean back against his pillows. A wave of something like shame washing over him. Medical records accessed through public health database. Leo Lopez diagnosed with congenital heart defect. Requires monthly medication and biannual cardiology appointments. Estimated annual medical costs, $30,000 to $1,000. Family income, approximately $35. $0 per year combined from both employment positions. No insurance coverage for existing conditions. Sister handles all medical decisions and expenses. The mathematics of survival were laid bare in those few sentences. She made $35,000 a year working herself to exhaustion at 2 jobs. And $32,000 of that went to keeping her brother alive. That left $3,000 for everything else: rent, food, utilities, transportation, clothing. All the countless expenses of simply existing in a world that charged money for everything. $3,000 was what he spent on a single dinner party. What he tipped his barber at Christmas. What he left lying in accounts he'd forgotten about because the amounts were too small to matter. And he'd refused to tip her on a $3,000 meal. He'd mocked her speed, her service, her very existence. He'd made a joke about her smile being the only tip she'd get. And his friends had laughed like it was the height of wit. That $3,000 meal could have been the difference between her making rent or not. Between Leo getting his medication or having to ration it. Between security and catastrophe. And he'd left nothing. Had walked out feeling clever and powerful. Had probably forgotten about her before he even reached his car. Jesus, he whispered to the empty room. The word both prayer and curse stopped Margaret, who had been standing quietly by the door, said softly, "There's more." He opened his eyes and looked at the next page. Educational history. Maya Lopez accepted to State University. Full academic scholarship. Major in biomedical engineering. Withdrew after one semester 2017 due to family emergency. Note: this coincides with mother's death and assumption of guardianship, so she'd had dreams once. Ethan realized she'd been smart enough and hard-working enough to earn a full scholarship to study engineering. Had been on track for the kind of life that could have lifted her out of poverty, given her options, opened doors, and she'd walked away from all of it to take care of her brother. Had sacrificed her own future without hesitation because family came first. Because someone had to. Because she was the only one who could. How many people would do that? How many people would give up everything they'd worked for, every dream they'd nurtured, every possibility they'd imagined, to take care of a teenager who wasn't even their own child? The answer, Ethan suspected, was far fewer than anyone wanted to admit. It was easier to talk about family values in the abstract than to actually live them. When they demanded everything you had. And this, Margaret said, placing one final document on top of the pile. This is from last month. It was a notice from their landlord. Final warning, rent payment 18 days overdue. Eviction proceedings will begin if full payment plus late fees $1,000 to $100 total. Not received by October 1st. The date on the notice was September 15th. Today was October 8th. Which meant, did she pay it? Ethan asked. Margaret shook her head slightly. I made some calls. She worked out an arrangement to pay in installments. She's covering it, but just barely. She took on extra shifts at both jobs. Extra shifts on top of what was already probably 70 hours a week. Extra hours on her feet. Extra time away from her brother. Extra exhaustion piled onto an already impossible burden. And through all of that worrying about eviction, scraping together rent money, working herself into the ground, she'd still taken the time to save him. She'd been walking home from one of those extra shifts when she'd found his car in the wreckage. Had been exhausted and worried and carrying her own crushing weight. And she'd stopped anyway. Ethan closed the folder slowly, carefully, as if it contained something fragile that might break if handled roughly. In a way, it did. It contained the story of a human being he'd failed to see. A person he'd looked through as if she were glass. A life he'd dismissed as irrelevant to his own existence. The weight of that failure pressed down on him like physical force. Margaret, he said quietly, I need you to do something else for me. Of course. I want to go see her. Not today, I can barely stand. But soon. I want to talk to her face to face. Margaret nodded, making notes. But she also said something that made him pause. Sir, if I may, what are you planning? Because if this is about assuaging guilt, or making yourself feel better about what happened, it's not, he interrupted. Though even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. I mean, yes, I feel guilty. I should feel guilty. But that's not why I need to see her. He struggled to find the right words, frustrated by the limitations of language to capture what he was feeling. She saved my life, Margaret. Not because I deserved it, or because she thought I'd reward her, or because she wanted something from me. She saved me because she saw another human being in trouble, and that was reason enough. When was the last time someone did something for me without expecting something in return? When was the last time someone looked at me and saw a person instead of a walking bank account, or a business opportunity, or a stepping stone to something they wanted? Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "Never, sir." "The answer is never." He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought, and that's why I need to see her. Because she reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that there's a way to be human. That has nothing to do with money or power or any of the things I've spent my entire adult life chasing. And I need to understand that better. I need to understand her." "And then what?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted. "But I know I can't just go back to my life and pretend this didn't happen. I can't just send her a check and call it even, like she's some kind of service provider who performed a task. This is bigger than that." Over the next week, as his body slowly healed, and the doctors talked about rehabilitation timelines and physical therapy, and the long road to recovery ahead, Ethan found himself thinking constantly about Maya Lopez. He read and reread that thin folder until he'd practically memorized it, finding new details each time that painted a fuller picture of her life. He learned that she'd been on the honor roll throughout high school, that she'd volunteered at a homeless shelter on weekends before her mother got sick, that her teachers had written glowing recommendation letters talking about her extraordinary compassion and remarkable determination. He learned that Leo had been hospitalized twice in the past year for cardiac episodes, each time with Maya by his bedside, missing work and probably losing wages she couldn't afford to lose. He learned that she'd sold her mother's wedding ring last winter to cover an emergency medical bill, that she walked 45 minutes each way to work to save bus fare, that she ate instant ramen for nights a week so Leo could have real food. The details accumulated like drops of water, each one small, but together forming an ocean of sacrifice and strength that humbled him in ways he'd never experienced before. His board members came and went, discussing quarterly earnings and strategic initiatives and all the usual corporate machinery. His lawyers handled the insurance claims and the accident investigation, which had determined that the truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel and wasn't at fault criminally, but was liable civilly. His assistant kept his schedule and managed his affairs, and ensured that Vale Industries continued running smoothly despite his absence. Everyone did their jobs efficiently and professionally, and Ethan watched it all with a growing sense of detachment, as if he were observing someone else's life from a distance. What was the point of all of it, really? He'd spent 20 years building an empire, accumulating wealth that he could never spend in 10 lifetimes, wielding power that let him shape markets and influence politicians and make decisions that affected thousands of people. And none of it had mattered in that wrecked car. None of it had saved him. A waitress making $35,000 a year had saved him, using nothing but her bare hands and her stubborn refusal to walk away from someone in need. 2 weeks after the accident, when he could finally walk short distances with a cane, and the doctors had cleared him to leave the hospital for light activity, Ethan told his driver, "Take me to La Belle Maison." The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror with obvious concern. "Sir, are you sure you're well enough?" "I'm sure." "Take me there, now." When the black Mercedes pulled up in front of the restaurant, a different Mercedes, identical to the one that had been totaled, already replaced because that's what money did. It made disasters disappear as if they'd never happened. Ethan sat for a moment, looking at the golden doors and the glittering windows. He'd been here dozens of times over the years, had spent tens of thousands of dollars at tables where business deals were made, and alliances forged, and the machinery of wealth turned its endless gears. But he'd never really seen it before, had never thought about the people in uniforms gliding between tables, had never considered that each of them had a life and a story and dreams that his tips, or lack thereof, might affect. He pushed open the door, his cane tapping against the marble floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the hushed atmosphere, each tap like a slow heartbeat announcing his arrival. Every eye turned toward him: the hostess, the managers, the servers who had frozen mid-motion like deer sensing a predator. He could see the recognition rippling through the staff, could practically hear them thinking, "That's Ethan Vale, the billionaire. What's he doing here? Why does he look like that?" The manager rushed forward with the kind of nervous enthusiasm that wealthy patrons inspired. His smile too wide, his movements too quick. "Mr. Vale, what an honor to see you again. We heard about your accident. Terrible, just terrible. But you're looking well, all things considered. Your usual table is available if you'd like." "I'm not here to eat," Ethan said flatly, cutting through the obsequious babbling. "I'm looking for Maya Lopez. Is she working today?" The manager's smile faltered slightly, confusion replacing enthusiasm. "Maya, yes, she's in the back right now. But sir, if there was some problem with her service..." "There was no problem," Ethan said, more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone. "I just need to speak with her, please." The manager hesitated, clearly uncertain about protocol. Was this a complaint disguised as politeness? Was one of his servers about to be fired or sued or worse? But ultimately he couldn't refuse a request from Ethan Vale. He nodded and disappeared through the kitchen doors, and Ethan was left standing in the dining room, leaning on his cane, acutely aware that every person in the restaurant was trying not to stare at him, while absolutely staring at him. Moments later, Maya appeared through the kitchen doors, her uniform spotless as always, her hair tied neatly back, a tray of water glasses balanced on one hand with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of doing this exact motion thousands of times. She froze when she saw him, her entire body going still, her eyes widening with something that might have been surprise or fear or recognition, or all three at once. Their eyes met across the dining room, and the silence stretched between them thick and heavy with everything unsaid. With the weight of their two previous encounters, one where he'd been cruel and she'd been professional, one where she'd been compassionate and he'd been helpless. The restaurant had gone completely quiet, everyone watching this strange tableau. This billionaire and this waitress staring at each other like the rest of the world had fallen away. He spoke first, his voice carrying across the room despite his intention to keep it quiet. "You saved my life." Maya lowered her gaze, her cheeks coloring slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention from the other diners and staff. "Anyone would have done the same thing," she said softly. The same thing she'd said that night in the rain. "No," he said, taking a step closer, his cane tapping against the marble. "Not anyone. Especially not someone I treated the way I treated you." He could see her jaw tighten slightly, could see her hands grip the tray a little harder, could see the careful professional mask she wore starting to slip just slightly. She said nothing, just stood there holding that tray, waiting. The manager was hovering nearby, anxious and confused, clearly wondering if he should intervene or let this play out or call someone or even glanced around the restaurant at all the curious faces and realized this wasn't the place for the conversation he needed to have. "When do you get off work?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing at the manager, then back at Ethan. "My shift ends at midnight." He nodded once, decisively. "I'll wait, sir." "You don't need to." "I'll wait," he repeated, more firmly. "I need to talk to you, please." There was something in that last word, please, that seemed to catch her off guard. Maybe because people like him didn't say please to people like her, didn't ask for things so much as expect them to happen. But he meant it. Needed her to understand that this wasn't a command from a wealthy customer to a service worker, but a request from one human being to another. After a long moment, she nodded slightly. "Okay." Ethan spent the next several hours in his car outside the restaurant, sending messages to Margaret about meetings he'd miss tomorrow, responding to emails that seemed increasingly meaningless, and mostly just thinking. His leg ached from standing earlier, and the pain medication was wearing off, but he didn't leave. He told her he would wait, and he would keep that promise, no matter how long it took. Just after midnight, as the last diners were leaving and the staff were beginning their closing duties, Maya emerged from the golden doors. She'd changed out of her uniform into jeans and a thin jacket, her hair down now, and she looked even more tired than she had earlier. The kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could truly fix. She paused when she saw his car still parked there, probably half expecting him to have left. And when he opened the door and climbed out with his cane, she walked slowly toward him. "I know this is strange," he began, leaning against the car for support, "but I wanted to thank you properly. Not just words in a hospital room that I barely remember." "You already said thank you," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "That's enough." "No," he said, and the word came out more intense than he intended. It's not even close to enough." He gestured toward a small cafe down the block that was still open. One of those 24-hour places that catered to night shift workers and insomniacs. "Could we talk? Just for a few minutes, please?" She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and he found himself holding his breath while waiting for her answer. She could say no. She had every right to say no. To walk away from him the way she could have walked away from his wrecked car. To refuse to give him any more of her time or energy or attention. He wouldn't blame her if she did. But finally, she nodded. Okay, but just for a few minutes. I have to get home. My brother worries if I'm too late. Asterisk. They walked the half block to the cafe in silence, Ethan moving slowly with his cane, Maya adjusting her pace to match his. Neither of them speaking, but both acutely aware of the other's presence. The cafe was nearly empty. Just a tired-looking barista behind the counter, and an old man reading a newspaper in the corner. They ordered coffee black for him, with cream and too much sugar for her, and sat at a corner table, steam rising from their cups like small prayers ascending. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. Just waited with everything that had happened and everything that needed to be said, and the vast gulf of experience and circumstance that separated their two lives. Finally, Ethan said quietly, when I was trapped in that car, pinned and bleeding and certain I was going to die there, I thought about everything I'd built. The companies, the mansions, the money in accounts I'd forgotten about because the amounts were too small to matter. All of it, everything I'd spent 20 years accumulating and protecting and growing. He met her gaze, and none of it mattered. Not one single dollar made any difference. But one thing haunted me, kept playing over and over in my mind while I waited for help that I didn't think would come. What? She asked softly. The look on your face that night at the restaurant when I called you slow. When I made jokes about you to my friends. When I refused to leave even a small tip after you'd worked all day serving people like me. The look in your eyes when I said you could keep your smile, because it was the only tip you'd get. He had to pause, had to swallow past the tightness in his throat. I remembered your face, and I realized that I'd spent so long thinking of people as either useful to me or irrelevant that I'd forgotten they were people at all. Maya looked down at her coffee, her expression carefully neutral. It's forgotten. No, he whispered, the word fierce despite its softness. I can't forget it. I don't want to forget it. Because forgetting it means going back to being the person who could say those things without thinking twice. Who could treat another human being like they were nothing and feel clever about it? He leaned forward slightly, ignoring the pull of his injuries. Tell me about your brother. Please. Asterisk. Her eyes flicked up in surprise, searching his face for something mockery, perhaps, or some hidden agenda. Some reason why a billionaire would care about the personal life of a waitress. My brother? Why do you want to know about Leo? Because I read your file, he admitted, watching her expression harden slightly at this invasion of privacy. I had my assistant research you, which I know wasn't right, wasn't fair to you. But I needed to understand the person who saved me. And what I learned, he trailed off, struggling with how to articulate what he'd felt reading those cold facts. That added up to a portrait of sacrifice he couldn't fully comprehend. Her jaw tightened, and when she spoke, her voice had an edge to it that hadn't been there before. You had no right to investigate me. Asterisk. You're absolutely correct, he said immediately, not trying to defend or justify or minimize what he'd done. I didn't have the right, but I wanted to understand why you saved me. I needed to know who you were, because in my entire life, nobody has ever done something for me without expecting something in return. Nobody has ever looked at me and seen just another person who needed help. Instead of a walking bank account or a business opportunity or a way to advance themselves. Maya was quiet for a moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, resigned. Leo is my only family. Our parents died when I was 16, my father in a construction accident. When safety equipment failed, my mother from cancer 2 years later. Leo was just a kid, only 7 years old when Dad died. I dropped out of college after 1 semester when Mom passed because someone had to take care of him. Someone had to work and pay rent and make sure he had food and clothes and medicine for his heart condition that costs more than most people make in a year. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw past the professional mask to the real person underneath, exhausted. Yes, and struggling, but also fierce and determined and unbowed by circumstances that would have broken most people. It's not easy. I work 2 jobs, sometimes more when I can find them. I walk to work instead of taking the bus to save money. I eat ramen most nights so Leo can have real food. I sold my mother's wedding ring last winter to pay for one of his hospital stays. It's not the life I imagined when I was a kid dreaming about the future. But he's worth everything, every sacrifice, every exhausted night, and every humiliation from people who think I'm less than human. Because I serve them food. That last part was aimed at him. He knew, a quiet arrow that hit its target with precision. He deserved it. He deserved worse than that. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate. Felt like offering a band-aid for a gunshot wound. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for the cruelty, for the jokes, for making you feel small when you were already carrying more weight than most people could handle. There's no excuse for it. I can't even explain it except to say that I'd spent so long at the top, surrounded by people who told me I was brilliant and powerful, and above the concerns of normal people, that I stopped seeing anyone below a certain income level as fully real. You were just furniture to me, a function, not a person, and that's unforgivable. Maya looked at him steadily, her dark eyes searching his face for sincerity or manipulation, or whatever truth lay beneath his words. So why tell me this now? Why track me down and wait for hours just to apologize? You could have sent flowers to the hospital or made a donation in my name, or done any of the things rich people do when they want to feel like they've evened the scales. Why this? It was a fair question, and Ethan took a moment to consider it seriously before answering. Because an apology isn't about making myself feel better or clearing my conscience, so I can go back to my life without guilt. An apology is about acknowledging harm done to another person and taking responsibility for it. And you can't take responsibility from a distance. You can't apologize through intermediaries or gifts or grand gestures that cost nothing. Because you have more money than you could ever spend, you have to look the person in the eye and say it directly. I was wrong. I hurt you, and I'm sorry. He paused, then added, and because I want to help. Not in a way that makes you dependent on me or puts you in my debt, or turns this into some kind of transaction where I give you money and consider us even, but in a way that acknowledges that I have resources I don't need or deserve. And you're working yourself to death trying to keep your brother alive. And there's something fundamentally wrong with a world where those two facts coexist without intersection. Maya shook her head, and he could see her defenses going up, could see her preparing to refuse whatever he was about to offer. I don't want your money, Mr. Vale. I don't want to be your charity case or your good deed that lets you sleep better at night. I take care of my brother. I always have. We manage, but you shouldn't have to just manage, he said gently. You should have the chance to thrive, to go back to school if you wanted, to not spend every waking moment working yourself into exhaustion just to survive. And Leo should have access to the medical care he needs without it consuming your entire income. That's not charity, that's basic human decency. Recognizing that the current distribution of resources is insane and trying to correct it, in whatever small way I can. And what do you get out of it? She asked, and there was skepticism in her voice. The wary distrust of someone who'd learned that nothing in life came for free. Nobody does something for nothing, especially not people like you. So, what's the angle? What do you want from me in return? Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without sounding like he was delivering some prepared speech. I want to be better than the person who insulted you that night. I want to prove to myself that I'm capable of seeing other people as human beings and acting accordingly. And I want, he hesitated, then continued, I want to understand what you have that I don't. This capacity for compassion that extends even to people who've wronged you. This strength that keeps you going when everything in your life is hard and unfair, and grinding you down. I've spent my whole life accumulating power, but you have something that all my billions can't buy, and I need to understand it better. Maya stared at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read her expression, something between confusion and suspicion and maybe, just maybe, the slightest softening around the edges. You want to learn compassion from me? From a waitress you insulted? From the person who saved my life when she had every reason not to? He corrected. Yes, because whatever you have, whatever quality allows you to do that, it's worth more than anything I've ever possessed. She shook her head slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth that wasn't quite humor, but wasn't quite sadness either. You're a strange man, Mr. Vale. Ethan, he said. Please, just call me Ethan. Mr. Vale is the person who runs companies and intimidates board members and treats waitresses like furniture. I want to be someone different. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee. The old man in a corner rustling his newspaper. The barista wiping down counters with methodical efficiency. Outside, the city continued its endless hum. Cars passing, people walking. The machinery of urban life grinding on regardless of the small human dramas. Playing out in corners CAFE acute S. Finally, Maya said quietly, I should get home. Leo will be worried, and I have another shift in 8 hours. Ethan nodded. Disappointed but understanding. Can I give you a ride home at least? My driver is right outside, and it's late. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of riding in his luxury car. of accepting even this small thing from him. But the walk was long, and her feet hurt, and she was so tired, so she finally nodded. "Okay, thank you." They rode in silence through the late-night streets, Maya giving directions to a neighborhood that Ethan had probably driven past 100 times, without ever really seeing. The buildings grew shabbier as they went, the streetlights more sporadic, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. When they pulled up in front of her apartment, building a 4-story structure with peeling paint and a door that didn't quite close properly, Ethan felt a wave of something that might have been shame or might have been anger at a system that allowed people to live like this while he owned multiple properties he'd visited once or never. "Thank you for talking to me tonight," he said as she reached for the door handle. "And thank you for saving my life. I know I'll never be able to repay that debt, but I want to try anyway. Not with money exactly, but with action. With being better. With doing something that matters." Maya looked at him with those tired, knowing eyes. "Then promise me one thing, Ethan. Anything. Don't ever treat anyone the way you treated me that night. Don't look at people who serve you, or work for you, or exist at a different economic level, and think they're worth less than you. Because we're all just trying to survive, and kindness costs nothing. And you never know when you might need someone to save you." The words hit him like a physical force. Simple truth delivered without malice or smugness. Just a fundamental principle of human decency that he'd somehow lost sight of during his climb to the top. "You have my word," he said quietly. "I promise." She nodded once, then climbed out of the car and disappeared into the building without looking back. Ethan sat a trif-concha for a long moment, staring at the door she disappeared through, at the building where she lived with her brother, at the reality of a life so different from his own that it might as well have been on another planet. "Sir," his driver said quietly from the front seat. "Where to?" "Home," Ethan said, though the word felt strange in his mouth, as if the penthouse apartment waiting for him wasn't really home, so much as just another expensive box he occupied. "Take me home." But he knew he wouldn't sleep that night. Knew he'd spend the dark hours thinking about Maya Lopez and her brother Leo, and the impossible mathematics of their survival. Thinking about the promise he'd made and what it would actually mean to keep it. Thinking about the distance between who he'd been and who he wanted to become. 3 days passed, and Ethan found himself unable to concentrate on anything that had once seemed vitally important. Board meetings came and went with him, offering minimal input, letting his executives handle decisions he would normally have controlled with an iron fist. Margaret noticed the change, commenting carefully that he seemed distracted and not quite himself, which was perhaps the most diplomatic way to say that the ruthless CEO who had built Vale Industries through sheer force of will appeared to have been replaced by someone quieter, more contemplative, more uncertain. He spent hours researching things he'd never thought about before: the cost of living for minimum wage workers, the gaps in health insurance coverage, the affordable housing crisis, the way systemic poverty trapped people in cycles they couldn't escape no matter how hard they worked. He read articles and studies and first-person accounts, and each one felt like another indictment of the world he'd helped create and profited from. A world where people like Maya worked themselves to exhaustion while people like him accumulated wealth they couldn't possibly use. On the fourth day, he called Margaret into his office and said, "I need you to find me a property. Nothing too ostentatious, but nice safe neighborhood, good schools nearby, 3 bedrooms at least. Something with a yard, maybe. A place where a family could actually live, not just survive." Margaret's pen paused over her notepad. "Sir, are you looking to add to your real estate portfolio? Because the investment advisors have suggested it's not for me," he interrupted. "And it's not an investment. I'm giving it to someone." There was a long pause. "Giving it to someone? Sir, I'm not sure I understand." "You don't need to understand," he said, not unkindly. "Just find the property, quietly. I don't want any media attention. No press releases about charitable donations or any of that. This is private." Margaret looked like she wanted to argue or ask more questions or perhaps suggest he was having some kind of breakdown, but ultimately she simply nodded. "Of course, Mr. Vale. Any particular area?" "Somewhere near East Briar Street," he said, thinking of Maya's long walk to work. The 45 minutes each way she spent on her feet because she couldn't afford bus fare, but nicer, safe, the kind of place where a teenage boy could walk to school without worrying. By the end of the week, Margaret had found 3 potential properties. Ethan went to see them himself, walking through empty rooms with his cane, imagining what each space might mean to someone who'd spent years in a cramped apartment, with leaking faucets and unreliable heat. The first was too cold, too sterile. All sharp angles and modern fixtures that felt more like a showroom than a home. The second was closer, but felt closed in. The rooms too small. The yard barely more than a concrete patch. The third property was different. It was a house on Willow Lane, a tree-lined street in a quiet neighborhood that somehow managed to feel both substantial and welcoming. The house itself was 2 stories with warm brick facade and white trim. Large windows that let in natural light. A wraparound porch with space for chairs where you could sit in the evening and watch the world go by. Inside, the rooms were spacious, but not cavernous. Hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves. A kitchen that looked like the kind of place where families gathered for meals and homework and conversation. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, one large enough to be a master bedroom, 2 smaller ones that would be perfect for Leo, and perhaps eventually a study space for Maya, if she ever wanted to go back to school. But it was the backyard that made Ethan's decision. It was larger than he'd expected, with mature trees providing shade. A small garden area that someone had once cared for and could be cared for again, and enough open space for a teenager to kick a soccer ball or just lie in the grass and look at the stars. He stood there in that yard, imagining Leo running around, imagining Maya sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee and maybe, for once, not looking quite so exhausted. "This one," he told Margaret. "Purchase it immediately. Full price, cash offer, close as quickly as possible. And I want it fully furnished, nothing too expensive or flashy, but quality furniture. Stocked kitchen, everything someone would need to move in tomorrow. Hire an interior decorator if necessary, but tell them it's for a single mother with a teenage son. Close enough to the truth that the decorator would make appropriate choices. And the deed? Margaret asked, in Maya Lopez's name. Free and clear. No mortgage. No strings attached. Set up a trust to cover property taxes and insurance for the next 20 years. Anonymous funding she shouldn't know where the money comes from. Margaret's expression was carefully neutral, but he could see the questions in her eyes. This wasn't how wealthy people typically gave to charity. No foundation, no tax benefits, no naming rights or publicity. This was just giving, helping, with no expectation of return or recognition. Sir, if I may, the tax implications of this will be significant. If you structure it differently, I don't care about the tax implications, Ethan said firmly. Just make it happen. And Margaret, not a word about this to anyone. Not the board, not the press, not even my attorney unless absolutely legally necessary. This is private, of course, sir. The purchase and preparation took another week, during which Ethan found himself obsessively checking on progress, making sure every detail was right. He had the heating system inspected and upgraded, the water heater replaced, the roof checked for leaks. He had the garden cleaned up and replanted with hardy flowers that wouldn't require expert care. He ensured the internet was set up and paid for, the utilities transferred and secured. Every small thing he could think of that would make the house not just habitable, but actually comfortable. He attended to with a focus he'd never brought to any of his business deals. When everything was finally ready, he had a single key made old-fashioned brass, weighty and substantial, and placed it in a simple white envelope along with a handwritten note. He drafted and discarded a dozen versions of that note, struggling to find words that would convey what he wanted without sounding patronizing or self-congratulatory or like he expected something in return. Finally, he settled on something simple. You once gave me my life back. Let me give you space to live yours. A Vale he had Margaret arrange for the envelope to be delivered to Maya's apartment, handed to her by an assistant who was instructed to simply give it to her and leave. No explanations, no waiting for a response. Just deliver and go. Then he waited. He waited through that entire day and into the evening, checking his phone obsessively even though he'd given her no way to contact him, pacing his penthouse apartment until his leg ached from the exertion. What would she think? Would she be angry at this intrusion into her life? Would she refuse the gift? See it as charity she didn't want, or an attempt to control her, or some kind of power play? Would she even go see the house, or would she throw the key away assuming it was some kind of mistake or scam? The uncertainty ate at him in a way that business negotiations never had. In business, he always knew the angles, always understood what people wanted and how to leverage that knowledge. But this was different. This wasn't about leverage or advantage or getting something in return. This was about trying to do something good without expectation. And he had no framework for how that worked or whether he was doing it right. Maya received the envelope just before midnight, as she was returning from her shift at Quickmart, exhausted and thinking about nothing except getting a few hours of sleep. before her morning shift at the restaurant. The man in a black suit standing outside her apartment building startled her. At first you learned to be wary of strangers in this neighborhood, especially at this hour, but he simply handed her the envelope with a polite "Miss Lopez" and left before she could ask any questions. Inside her apartment, with Leo asleep on the couch because it was cooler out there than in the bedroom they shared, Maya opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The key fell into her palm, heavy and real and impossible. She stared at it for a long moment, then unfolded the note and read the words once, twice, 3 times, each reading making less sense than the last dot space to live her life. What did that mean? And this key a key to what? The address written on the envelope meant nothing to her at first. Just numbers and a street name she'd never heard of. She almost didn't go. Almost convinced herself it was some kind of mistake or scam, or perhaps a cruel joke. Because things like this didn't happen to people like her. But something in those few words, the simplicity of them, the lack of flourish or explanation, made her curious enough to take the bus the next morning. Using fare she'd budgeted for groceries, following the address to a neighborhood she'd never had reason to visit. When she found Willow Lane, she almost got back on the bus. The houses here were too nice, too far outside her reality. Tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns, children riding bicycles without fear. The kind of neighborhood she'd dreamed about when she was younger, but had long since accepted, was not meant for people in her position. She must have written down the address wrong, she thought. Or maybe this was indeed some kind of mistake. But then she saw the number on the mailbox 27 and her breath caught in her throat. The house was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Not ostentatious, but simply right. Solid and warm and welcoming. The kind of place that looked like safety felt. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, the key clutched in her hand, not daring to hope this could possibly be what it seemed. An older woman was tending the garden next door, and she looked up with a friendly smile. "Can I help you, dear? Are you looking for someone by?" "I'm not sure," Maya said honestly. "I received this address and a key, but I think there might be some mistake." The woman's smile widened. "Oh, you must be Miss Lopez. Mr. Vale said you might come today. I'm Martha, your new neighbor. Welcome to Willow Lane. Your new neighbor. Welcome." The words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through a fog of disbelief and confusion and something that might have been hope, but felt too dangerous to acknowledge. "I don't understand," Maya whispered. Martha's expression softened with sympathy. "Why don't you go inside and see for yourself, dear? I believe you'll find everything in order. And if you need anything at all, I'm right next door. My husband and I have lived here for 30 years. It's a wonderful neighborhood. Very safe for children. I understand you have a brother." Maya could only nod, unable to form words, and Martha patted her arm gently before returning to her garden, leaving Maya alone with the key and the impossible possibility it represented. With shaking hands, Maya walked up the front path, her worn shoes on stones that had been recently reset and leveled. The key slid into the lock smoothly, and when she turned it and pushed open the door, she stepped into another world. The interior took her breath away, not because it was lavish or expensive looking, but because it was perfect. Warm hardwood floors gleamed in the morning light streaming through large windows. The living room had a comfortable couch and chairs arranged around a fireplace that looked like it actually worked, not just for show. Built-in bookshelves begged to be filled. The dining room had a table large enough for family dinners, the kind she remembered from before her parents died. The kind she dreamed of giving Leo someday. She moved through the house in a daze, opening doors, running her hands along walls that were smooth and well-painted, testing faucets that actually had water pressure, flipping light switches that all worked. The kitchen was stocked not fully, but with basics, the kind of staples someone would need to cook actual meals. The refrigerator was new and humming quietly, already cold and ready to be filled. Upstairs, the bedrooms were furnished simply, but well-real mattresses, not second-hand things that sagged in the middle. Clean linens that smelled like lavender and sunshine. In what was clearly meant to be the master bedroom, she found a second note, this one longer, resting on the dresser. Maya, I know this must seem overwhelming, perhaps even unwelcome. I struggled with whether this was the right thing to do, whether it would seem like charity or pity, or an attempt to somehow buy redemption for my past behavior. But ultimately, I realized that overthinking kindness defeats its purpose. You work 2 jobs to keep your brother alive and housed. You walk 45 minutes each way to save bus fare. You eat ramen so he can have real food. You gave up your dreams and your education to care for him. And when you found me dying in a wrecked car, even after I had humiliated you and treated you as less than human, you saved my life without hesitation. This house is not payment for saving me. That debt can never be repaid, because you can't put a price on life. This is not charity that places you in my debt or obligates you to gratitude. This is simply an attempt to redistribute resources in a way that makes sense. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. You have been working yourself to death just to survive. That imbalance is wrong, and this is my small attempt to correct it. The house is yours, free and clear. The deed is in your name. There is no mortgage, no rent, no strings attached. Property taxes and insurance are paid through a trust for the next 20 years. The utilities are set up and paid for the first year. This is not a loan or a gift that comes with expectations. This is yours. I will not contact you again unless you wish it. This is not about building a relationship or earning your forgiveness or feeling better about myself. This is about doing the right thing simply because it's right. You told me to never treat people the way I treated you. I'm trying to live up to that promise by recognizing your humanity and your worth, and your right to live without constant struggle. I hope you can accept this in the spirit it's offered, with sincere respect and gratitude. Ethan Vale *. Maya read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen. Wealthy men didn't just give houses to waitresses they'd insulted. There had to be a catch, some hidden clause, some expectation that would emerge later and turn this fairy tale into another nightmare. But the more she looked around, The more she examined every corner of this perfect house, the more she realized there was no catch. The deed was genuinely in her name. She found the paperwork in a folder on the kitchen counter. Everything legal and official and real. The trust documents were there too. Technical legal language that she struggled through, but which seemed to genuinely guarantee 20 years of property tax and insurance payments with no obligations on her part. She sank down onto the floor in the middle of the empty living room and cried great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside. Years of exhaustion and fear and struggling and barely hanging on. All of it pouring out in a release she hadn't known she needed. She cried for herself, for Leo, for her parents who would never see this, for the girl she'd been at 18 when the world had crashed down around her, and she'd had to become an adult overnight. But she also cried with something that felt like joy, or hope, or the possibility of a future that wasn't just endless grinding survival. She cried because someone had seen her, really seen her, and had decided her life mattered enough to change it. Not for credit or publicity or even gratitude, but simply because it was the right thing to do. When she finally stopped crying and pulled herself together enough to think clearly, her first thought was Leo. She needed to tell Leo. She needed to show him this house that was theirs. This space where he could have his own room and a yard to play in and neighbors who weren't screaming at all hours and a kitchen where she could cook real meals. She locked the door carefully, clutching the key like it might vanish if she wasn't careful, and took the bus back to their apartment. Leo was awake when she arrived, eating cereal and watching cartoons before school, and he looked up with surprise when she burst through the door with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in years. "Maya, what happened? Are you okay?" "Leo," she said, and her voice was shaking with emotions she couldn't name. "Leo, I need you to trust me. I need you to come with me. Right now, before school." He frowned, immediately worried because she was always so careful about him not missing school, so insistent that his education mattered. "What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, laughing through fresh tears. "Something's right. Something's finally, impossibly right. Come on, bring your bag. We're not coming back here." "What?" "Maya, you're not making sense. I know I'm not. Just, please trust me. Come with me." And he did, because he always had. Because she was the only family he had, and she'd never let him down. They took the bus to Willow Lane, Leo asking questions the entire way that she couldn't quite answer, because she still didn't fully believe it herself. When they arrived and she showed him the house, his face went through a series of expressions she would remember for the rest of her life: confusion, disbelief, wonder, joy. "This is ours?" he whispered, standing in the living room and turning in a slow circle. "This is really ours?" "It's really ours," she confirmed, still half expecting someone to burst in and tell them it was all a mistake. "You can have your own room, Leo. A real room with a door that closes and space for your things. And there's a yard where you can." She didn't get to finish because he hugged her, fierce and tight, and she could feel him trembling against her. "How?" he asked into her shoulder. How did this happen? And so she told him the story about the accident, about saving Ethan Vale, about the apology and the conversation, and now this impossible gift that she still didn't fully understand. Leo listened with wide eyes, and when she finished, he said something that surprised her. He must have been really sorry. What? Mr. Vale? He must have been really sorry for how he treated you. To do something like this. People don't usually apologize with houses. Maya laughed despite herself. No, they usually don't. Are you going to thank him? She thought about that. Was she going to thank him? Should she? The note had said he wouldn't contact her again unless she wished it. That this wasn't about building a relationship or earning gratitude. But surely this deserves some kind of acknowledgement. Some response beyond just accepting it in silence. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe I need to think about it. They spent the rest of the day moving their few belongings from the apartment to the house, which didn't take long because they didn't have much. Years of poverty teaching them to live light, to not accumulate things that couldn't be easily transported, or might need to be sold in an emergency. Their clothes fit into 2 duffel bags, their dishes and cookware into 3 boxes, Leo's books and school supplies into another box. The furniture in the old apartment wasn't theirs, came with the place. So they left it for whoever moved in next door by evening. They were sitting on the porch of their new house, their house. Those words still feeling foreign in Maya's mind-eating pizza they'd splurged on to celebrate, and watching the sun set through the trees. Leo was already talking about which bedroom he wanted, about maybe joining the soccer team at school now that he had a yard to practice in, about inviting friends over for the first time in years, because he wouldn't be embarrassed about where he lived. And Maya felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Peace, not happiness exactly, because she was still processing. Still waiting for the other shoe to drop, still unsure how to exist in this new reality. But peace, the sense that maybe, just maybe, the constant struggle was over, that they had space to breathe now, room to exist without always fighting for survival. That night, after Leo had gone to bed in his new room and finally fallen asleep after hours of excitement, Maya sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and pulled out a notepad. She stared at the blank page for a long time, pen hovering over paper, trying to figure out what to say. How do you thank someone for giving you your life back? How do you express gratitude for something so enormous that normal words feel inadequate? How do you respond to kindness that expects nothing in return? When you've spent your whole life learning that everything comes with a price. Ethan, I don't have words that feel big enough for what you've done. This house, this gift, it's more than shelter or property or any physical thing. It's possibility. It's breathing room. It's the difference between surviving and actually living. I want to be angry that you investigated my life without permission. Part of me is, but I also understand why you did it. And I can't maintain anger in the face of what you've done with that knowledge. You asked me once why I saved you after how you treated me. The answer hasn't changed, because you're human and you needed help. But I understand now that there was something else too. I saved you because that's who I want to be, someone who helps when they can. Who doesn't let past hurts dictate present actions? who sees people in need and responds with compassion rather than judgment. You've given me something I can never repay, but I don't think you want repayment. You want to be better than who you were. I can see that. I can feel it in this gift that asks nothing of me, expects nothing from me, simply offers space and security because everyone deserves those things. So I'll tell you what I told you that night. You're going to be okay. You're already becoming okay. The person who humiliated me at that restaurant wouldn't have done this. That person couldn't have seen past his own ego and assumptions to recognize another human being's worth. You're not that person anymore, or you're trying not to be, and that matters. I don't know if we'll see each other again. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just these two people crossing paths at moments when they needed each other, changing each other's lives in ways that ripple outward beyond either of us. Thank you for the house, yes, but more than that, thank you for seeing me, for recognizing that I'm not just a waitress or a service worker or someone beneath your notice, but a whole person with dreams and struggles and worth. Thank you for proving that people can change, that cruelty doesn't have to be permanent, that redemption is possible. I promise to use this gift well, to take care of Leo, to maybe, someday, go back to school, to pay forward the kindness you've shown by helping others when I can, to remember that grace isn't earned, it's given freely. The way you've given this to us. With gratitude and respect. Maya Lopez **. She folded the letter carefully and addressed an envelope to Vale Industries. Not sure if it would reach him or if he'd even read it, but feeling like it needed to be said anyway, she mailed it the next morning on her way to La Belle Maison, where she would work one final shift before giving her notice, because she could do that now. She could quit one of her jobs, could actually sleep a full night occasionally, could spend time with Leo instead of always working. The trust fund would cover the house expenses, and her single salary from the restaurant would be enough for food and clothes, and the normal expenses of life now that she didn't have rent eating up most of her income. She could breathe. Finally, after 8 years of holding her breath and waiting for the next disaster, she could breathe. 3 months passed, and Maya found herself living a life she'd never imagined possible. She'd given her notice at Quickmart, working her final shift there with a mixture of relief and strange nostalgia for the familiar struggle, even as she recognized how much healthier she felt with actual sleep and time to rest between shifts. She'd kept her job at La Belle Maison because she was good at it, and because some part of her wasn't ready to completely abandon the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. But she'd reduced to 4 shifts a week instead of 6, giving herself time to simply exist. Leo was thriving in ways that broke her heart with joy. He joined the school soccer team, made friends who came over to practice in their yard, started talking about college with the kind of hope she'd thought poverty had beaten out of him. His heart condition was being managed better now that she could afford all his medications, without having to choose between doses, and his cardiologist had commented on how much stronger he seemed at his last checkup. They turned the house into a real home, filling those bookshelves with second-hand books from the library's annual sale, hanging pictures on walls, planting vegetables in the garden that Martha next door taught Maya to care for. It was strange, learning to live without constant fear, without the daily calculations of survival that had consumed her for so long. Strange but wonderful, like learning to walk after years of crawling. But as the months passed, and the initial shock of her new circumstances faded into grateful normalcy, Maya found herself thinking often about Ethan's letter and his words about redistributing resources. She thought about the fact that she'd been saved by random chance, by happening to be the waitress at his table, by happening to walk past his accident, by catching the attention of someone with the power to change her life with what was, to him, barely noticeable expense. And she thought about all the other people still struggling the way she'd struggled. All the other Mayas and Leos out there working multiple jobs and eating ramen and walking long distances to save bus fare. People who wouldn't have chance encounters with guilty billionaires, whose lives would continue in that grinding survival mode until something broke their health, their hope, their ability to keep going. That's when the idea came to her, sitting on her back porch one evening while Leo did homework at the kitchen table, and the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. She had space now, more space than two people needed. She had resources, not wealth but enough, more than she'd ever had before. And she had experience surviving poverty, understanding what actually helped versus what sounded good but missed the mark. What if she used this gift not just for herself and Leo, but for others who needed it? What if this house became more than just her home, but a way station for people fighting the same battles she'd fought? The more she thought about it, the more the idea took shape. She could offer the guest room to women fleeing difficult situations, just temporarily until they got on their feet. She could host weekend meals for service workers from the neighborhood, the kind of real food she'd craved during her years of instant noodles. She could create a space where people who felt invisible might feel seen, where those struggling might find community and support, and the reminder that they weren't alone. She spent weeks planning, researching what would be legal and practical, talking to Martha next door, who turned out to have connections with local social services organizations. She drafted guidelines and thought through logistics and ran numbers to make sure she could afford it on her reduced income. And when she finally felt ready, she reached out to a few organizations that worked with struggling families and service workers, offering her home as a resource. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, she'd hosted her first guest, a young woman named Carla, who'd left an abusive relationship and needed somewhere safe to stay while she waited for a spot in a longer-term shelter. Carla stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in the guest room, slowly healing from trauma. And Maya found that helping her helped something in Maya too, gave purpose to her good fortune beyond just enjoying it privately. Then came the weekend meals. She started simply, posting a notice at Quickmart and a few other service industry workplaces in the area. Free dinner every Sunday, 6 p.m., 27 Willow Lane. Service workers welcome. No judgment, no expectations, just food and community. The first Sunday, 3 people showed up to night shift convenience store workers and a janitor from the local hospital. The second Sunday, there were 7. By the second month, she was regularly feeding 15 to 20 people every weekend. Her kitchen full of conversation and laughter, and the kind of exhausted camaraderie that came from shared struggle. Leo helped. Surprisingly enthusiastic about the project once he understood what she was trying to do. He'd set up tables, help serve food, talk to guests about school and sports, and normal things that made them feel human, rather than just struggling. Martha pitched into bringing desserts and helping with dishes. And gradually other neighbors started contributing a donation of groceries here, an offer to help cook there, the community coming together in ways Maya hadn't expected. She called it the Lantern House because she wanted it to be a light in the darkness for people trying to find their way through difficult times. She painted a small sign for the front porch with a lantern design that Leah helped her create. And she kept the porch light on every night as a symbol that someone here saw you. Someone here cared. Someone here understood. 6 months after receiving the house, Maya wrote another letter to Ethan, care of Vale Industries. Ethan, I'm writing to tell you how your gift has continued to change lives, not just mine and Leo's, but others you'll never meet who've been touched by the ripple effects of your kindness. The house has become something more than just where we live. It's become a resource for people who are where I was a year ago, struggling, exhausted, unseen. I've been hosting women who need temporary shelter, feeding service workers who can't always afford groceries, creating space for people to rest and be human and remember that their struggle isn't their worth. I'm telling you this not because I want more from you or because I think you need to know how your money is being used. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that real kindness multiplies. You helped me, and now I can help others. You gave me space to breathe, and now I'm trying to give that space to people who need it. This is how we change the world, not through grand gestures that make headlines, but through small acts of recognition and compassion that ripple outward beyond our sight. I see you sometimes on billboards and in business news, and I wonder if you're still trying to be the person you told me you wanted to become. I hope you are. I hope you've kept your promise to treat people with dignity, to remember that we're all human regardless of our economic circumstances. I don't need a response to this letter. I just wanted you to know that your attempt at redemption didn't end with giving me a house. It's continuing every Sunday when my kitchen fills with people who are tired and struggling and grateful for a meal and kind words. It's continuing every time someone stays in my guest room and leaves feeling a little more whole. It's continuing in ways neither of us could have predicted, but both of us, I think, would be proud of. Thank you for teaching me that receiving help doesn't make you weak, and that having more than you need creates an obligation to share. Thank you for showing me that people can change, and that mistakes don't have to define us forever. With continued gratitude, Maya Lopez S. Leo wanted me to tell you that he made the school soccer team, and that his team is called the Tigers and they're going to regionals. He says you probably don't care about middle school soccer, but I told him you might. I hope I was right about that. She mailed the letter without expecting a reply, content to simply share what had become of his gift. To close a circle that perhaps didn't need closing, but felt right to complete anyway. Epilogue. 2 years later, morning sun poured through the windows of the lantern house, illuminating a kitchen filled with activity. Maya was preparing food for that evening's Sunday dinner, now a well-established tradition that regularly drew 30 to 40 people, when her phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello, Miss Lopez? This is Margaret Chen, assistant to Ethan Vale. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Maya's hand stilled on the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. She hadn't heard from anyone connected to Ethan in over a year, since she'd sent that last letter telling him about the lantern house. "No, it's fine. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, yes. Actually, Mr. Vale asked me to reach out to you. He was wondering if he might visit the lantern house this Sunday for your regular dinner. He's read your letters, both of them, and he'd like to see what you've built, but only if you're comfortable with that. He doesn't want to intrude or make you feel obligated." Maya was quiet for a moment, processing. In her mind, Ethan Vale had remained a kind of abstract figure, the wealthy man who'd changed her life and then disappeared, existing mainly as a story she told about unlikely redemption and unexpected kindness. The thought of him actually here, in her kitchen, eating with the people who gathered here every week, felt strange and slightly surreal. But also, she realized, it felt right. Tell him yes, she said. Tell him he's welcome. Dinner starts at 6, but people start arriving around 5:30. It's casual, just bring yourself. That Sunday, Maya found herself uncharacteristically nervous, changing her shirt twice and fussing over details that normally didn't bother her. Leo noticed and teased her gently about it, which helped ease the tension. By the time 5:30 arrived and guests started flowing in, she'd mostly forgotten her nerves in the familiar rhythm of welcoming people and making sure everyone felt comfortable. At 6:15, when the house was full and conversations were flowing and the smell of food filled every room, Ethan Vale arrived. He came alone, no driver or assistant or entourage, just a man in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, carrying a bottle of wine and looking uncertain in a way that made him seem more human than the billionaire CEO she'd seen on billboards. Their eyes met across the crowded living room, and for a moment it was just the two of them, separated by 2 years and profound change and the strange journey that had connected their lives. Then Maya smiled and crossed the room to greet him. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "Thank you for having me," he replied, and rich of conscience she could see in his eyes that he meant it. That this wasn't some obligatory appearance or publicity stunt, but genuine desire to be here, to see what had grown from the seed he'd planted. She introduced him to the room not as Ethan Vale the billionaire, but simply as my friend Ethan, who's joining us for dinner, and watched as he shook hands with night shift workers and single mothers and elderly janitors, speaking to each person with attention and respect that seemed effortless now, as if he'd spent the past 2 years practicing exactly this kind of human connection. Maybe he had. During dinner, Maya watched him from across the table as he sat between a Quick Mart cashier named Jerome and a hospital cafeteria worker named Dolores, listening to their stories about difficult customers and ungrateful bosses and the small victories. That kept them going. He didn't dominate the conversation or try to offer solutions, or slip into the role of wealthy savior. He just listened, really listened, and occasionally shared his own stories, carefully edited versions of his journey from arrogant CEO to someone trying to be better, from someone who'd treated service workers as invisible to someone who'd learned the hard way that every person mattered. After dinner, when most of the guests had left and a few lingered helping with dishes, Ethan and Maya finally had a moment alone on the back porch. The same porch where she'd first conceived of the lantern house. "This is remarkable," Ethan said quietly, looking back through the window at the people still laughing in her kitchen. "What you've built here, it's exactly what I hoped would happen, but better than I could have imagined. It's what you made possible," Maya reminded him. "Without this house, no," he interrupted gently. "I gave you a house. You turned it into this. You took space and resources and used them to create community and compassion, and a place where people feel human. That's all you, Maya. That's who you are." They were quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I kept my promise," Ethan said eventually. "The one you asked me to make. I treat people differently now. It's not always easy. I spent decades building habits of dismissiveness and cruelty disguised as efficiency. But I'm trying. I've overhauled Vale Industries' treatment of service workers and low-level employees. We now pay everyone a living wage minimum, including contracted cleaning staff and cafeteria workers. We've established a hardship fund for employees facing medical emergencies or housing crises. I've started actually learning the names of people who work in my building, asking about their lives, seeing them." He paused, then added, "And I've started a foundation. Nothing with my name on it. It's called the Lantern Foundation, if you're okay with that. It buys properties in working-class neighborhoods and converts them into community resources like this. We have 3 operating now, with plans for 5 more next year. I've hired people who actually understand poverty and service work to run it. People with lived experience, not just theoretical knowledge. I'm trying to scale what you've done here, to help more people the way you helped me understand what help actually looks like." Maya felt tears prick her eyes. "You named it after my house?" "I named it after your vision," he corrected. "After the idea that those of us who have more than we need have an obligation to create light for people struggling in darkness. That's what you taught me. That's what I'm trying to live up to." "That's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan, that's more than redemption. That's transformation." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I can never undo the harm I caused over the years. All the people I treated as less than human. All the workers I underpaid or ignored or exploited through my business practices. That debt is too large to ever fully repay. But I can try to do better going forward. I can try to be the person I should have been all along. The person you reminded me was possible." They stood in comfortable silence as night settled fully over the neighborhood. Lights winking on in windows. The sounds of families settling in for the evening drifting through the air. Inside, Leo was showing Jerome and Dolores some game on his phone. Their laughter carrying through the open door. "I was wrong about you," Maya said suddenly. That night in the cafe when you said you wanted to help. I thought you were just another wealthy person trying to buy a clear conscience. I almost didn't accept the house because I was so sure there would be strings attached. Some expectation or obligation that would emerge later. But there wasn't. Ethan said no. There wasn't. And that's what changed everything. You gave without expecting return. You helped without demanding gratitude or control. You treated the gift as what it was, a transfer of resources from someone who had too much to someone who didn't have enough. No more complicated than that. She turned to face him fully. That's the lesson I've tried to carry forward with the Lantern House. When people come here, I don't ask them to be grateful or to tell me their life stories or to prove they deserve help. I just offer what I have: food, shelter, community, because they're human, and that's enough. You taught me that. You taught me that the most powerful gift is the one that asks nothing in return. You saved my life that night in the rain, Ethan said quietly. But you also saved something else, maybe my soul, if that doesn't sound too dramatic. You showed me that compassion isn't transactional, that kindness doesn't keep score, that our shared humanity matters more than any economic or social hierarchy we've constructed. He looked at her with an intensity that reminded her briefly of the arrogant man from the restaurant, but transformed now into something purposeful rather than cruel. I came here tonight not just to see the Lantern House, but to ask you something. The foundation is growing faster than I expected. We need people who understand both poverty and possibility, who've lived the struggle and emerged with compassion intact, who can guide this work with wisdom and experience. I'd like to offer you a position on the board of directors. Maya's breath caught. Me, Ethan, I'm not qualified for something like that. I don't have business experience or you have lived experience, he interrupted. You understand what help actually looks like from the receiving end. You've built something remarkable here with limited resources. You know how to create community and dignity and support without patronizing or infantilizing people who need help. That's more valuable than any business degree or philanthropic credential. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. This is the formal offer: salary, benefits, responsibilities. It's a real position with real compensation, not charity disguised as employment. The board meets once a month in person, with additional virtual meetings as needed. You'd help guide strategy, review grant applications, visit properties to ensure they're meeting community needs. You could keep working at La Belle Maison if you wanted, or transition to this full-time. Your choice. Maya took the envelope with trembling hands, not opening it yet. Why me? Because you understand what I'm still learning, Ethan said simply. Because you've turned suffering into service and pain into purpose. Because you saved my life and then showed me what to do with the second chance you gave me. Because I trust you to keep this work honest and human and focused on what actually matters. She opened the envelope and glanced at the salary figure, then had to read it again because it seemed impossible. It was more than she'd made in 3 years at both her jobs combined. Enough to live comfortably, to help Leo with college someday, to expand what she was doing at the Lantern House if she wanted. I need time to think about it, she said, her voice shaky. Of course. Take all the time you need. The offer stands for as long as you need to decide. They stood together in the darkness, and Maya thought about how strange life was, how impossible to predict. 2 years ago, she'd been walking home through rain and exhaustion, wondering how much longer she could keep going. She'd had every reason to walk past that wrecked car, to let karma run its course with a man who'd treated her cruelly. But she'd stopped anyway, had saved him anyway, and that single choice had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed both their lives, and was now rippling outward to touch hundreds of others. "Can I tell you something?" Maya said quietly. "Anything. That night when I found you in the car, bleeding and trapped, I knew who you were immediately. I recognized you. And for just a second, just one brief moment, I thought about walking away, about letting the universe balance its own scales, about leaving you there the way you'd left me, feeling worthless and invisible." Ethan was very still, listening. "But then I thought about my father," she continued. "He used to say that the measure of who you are isn't how you treat people who can help you, or reward you, or make your life easier. It's how you treat people who can't do anything for you at all. And I realized that if I walked away, if I let you die because you'd been cruel to me, I'd be letting you define who I was. I'd be giving you power over my character, letting your worst bring out my worst." She smiled slightly. "So I saved you. Not because you deserved it, or because I'm particularly noble, but because that's who I wanted to be, someone who helped when they could, regardless of whether the person needing help had earned it. And apparently, that choice changed everything." "It changed me," Ethan said softly. "It changed how I see the world, how I move through it, how I treat the people I encounter. You could have let me die and no one would have blamed you, but you didn't. You chose compassion over revenge, generosity over grudges, humanity over hierarchy. And that choice has continued to echo outward in ways neither of us could have predicted." He extended his hand to her, formal and yet intimate. "Thank you, Maya Lopez, for saving my life, for showing me what redemption looks like, for building something beautiful from the ashes of my guilt, for reminding me that we're all just human, all just trying to survive, and maybe, if we're lucky and brave, trying to help each other along the way." She took his hand, squeezing it firmly. "Thank you for proving that people can change, for keeping your promise, for using your resources to create light instead of casting shadows, for being brave enough to be vulnerable and honest about your mistakes." They shook hands there in the darkness. To people whose lives had intersected at moments of crisis and grace, whose choices had rippled outward to touch lives they'd never meet, whose shared journey from humiliation to redemption had proven that kindness was never wasted, and that everyone deserved the chance to be better than their worst moment. Inside, Leo called out that they were starting a card game if anyone wanted to join. Maya laughed and called back that they'd be right there, then turned to Ethan. "Want to stay?" Leo cheats at cards but pretends he doesn't. And Dolores tells the best stories about terrible hospital cafeteria customers. It's not glamorous, but it's real. "I'd like that," Ethan said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I'd like that very much." They walked back inside together, into the warm light and laughter of the Lantern House, into the community that had grown from a single act of compassion into the proof that grace could transform everything if you were brave enough to offer it, and humble enough to receive it. And somewhere in the night, the lantern on the front porch burned steadily on, a beacon for anyone who needed to find their way home. A reminder that in a world often dark and cruel and indifferent, there were still people who saw you, who cared about you, who would help you simply because you were human, and that was reason enough. In the end, this story isn't really about a billionaire and a waitress, though that's how it began. It's about the truth that we're all more than our worst moments, and better than our best ones. It's about how a single choice to help or to harm, to see or to ignore, to offer grace or to withhold, it can ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control. Even Vale learned that wealth without humanity is just numbers in accounts that mean nothing when you're dying in a wrecked car. Maya Lopez learned that receiving help doesn't make you weak, and that having more than you need creates both opportunity and obligation. Together, they learned that redemption isn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. What about small daily choices to be kinder, more aware, more human? The Lantern House continues to this day, feeding people every Sunday, housing those who need temporary shelter, creating space for community in a world that often isolates us. The Lantern Foundation has grown to operate 17 properties across 6 cities, each one run by people with lived experience of poverty, each one designed to offer help that preserves dignity. And every person who's been touched by these places carries forward the lesson that kindness multiplies, that compassion creates more compassion, that we're all connected in ways we can't always see but can always feel. Because true wealth isn't measured in dollars or properties or power over others. True wealth is measured in the lives you've touched, the help you've offered, the grace you've extended, even especially when it wasn't earned or expected or required. True wealth is measured in decency, in humanity, in the simple, profound act of seeing another person struggle and saying, "I see you. You matter. Let me help." That's what Maya taught Ethan that rainy night when she saved his life. And that's what both of them taught the world by choosing, every day, to be better than their circumstances demanded, kinder than their experiences justified, more generous than anyone expected. That's the real story. That's what matters in the end. Not the mansion, not the money, not the dramatic reversals of fortune. Just 2 people who met at their worst and their best, who chose grace over grudges, who proved that we can all be better if we're just brave enough to try.